There's a dog in this story that 40 people wanted dead before lunch. I know how that sounds. I've watched men fall in love with horses, weep over a good cattle dog, name their trucks. But I never once in 61 years on this earth saw a yard full of decent people go quiet and cold the way they did when they wheeled that crate out into the auction sun. Nobody bid. Nobody breathed. A woman pulled her kid back by the collar like the thing might reach through steel. And I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest, because if you don't, you'll think I'm a fool. Maybe I am. But here's the truth I'd swear to with my hand on anything you put in front of me. 6 days after I paid $11 for the most hated animal in 3 counties, that dog did something no living creature should have been able to do. Something I still can't explain to the men I drink coffee with. Something that made a grown rancher sit down in the wet grass and cover his face so his neighbors wouldn't see. I wrote it all down. I write everything down, always have. It's a sickness. So this is from the ledger, more or less the way it happened. Stay with me to the end. The part you won't believe is the part that's true. The gavel hadn't come down on the dog yet, when I already knew I was going to do something stupid. I want to be clear that I didn't go to that auction for a dog. I went for a stock trailer and maybe a length of pipe gate if it went cheap, because the south fence had been listing since the spring floods and I'd run out of excuses. I had $40 folded in my shirt pocket and a list in my head and a plan to be home before the heat broke open the afternoon. That was the whole of it. A man my age learns to want small things. The big wanting only gets you hurt. The Hadley place was being sold off in pieces. Old Royce Hadley had died in March, went out in his recliner with the television on, which is as good a way as any, and his daughter back in Tucson didn't want the land or the troubles that came with it, so she sent a company truck and a clipboard and let strangers pick the bones. There's a particular sadness to that kind of sale. You stand in a yard and watch a man's life get carried off in the backs of pickups. His good saddle, his chest freezer. The chair, probably. Somebody bought the chair. I'm getting away from it. The dog. I'll tell you about the dog. They saved him for near the end, the way you do with a lot you expect to give trouble. By then the crowd had thinned to the serious folks and the curious ones, maybe 40 of us standing in the trampled grass with our hats low against the glare. When the auction boy and another fellow came around the side of the barn pushing a wheeled crate, I heard the change in the yard before I understood it. A murmur, then less than a murmur, then nothing. He wasn't a big dog. That surprised me. The way people talked, you'd have pictured something out of a nightmare, but he was a medium thing, some cattle dog mess crossed with something heavier, blue-gray and brindled like smoke caught in a fence. What you noticed wasn't the size. What you noticed was the face. Somebody somewhere sometime had taken a great deal off that face. One ear was gone to a stub. A seam of scar ran from his brow down across the bridge of his nose, pink where the fur wouldn't grow back. And his eyes, pale, amber, fixed, didn't move across the crowd the way a frightened animal's eyes do. They went still. They picked a point on the middle distance and held it like he'd decided, a long time ago, that none of us were worth the looking. "This here's the Hadley dog," the auctioneer said, and even he sounded like he'd rather be selling anything else. "Working age, sound far as we know. He killed Royce's healer," somebody called from the back. "Tore her up, everybody knows it." "He bit the brute boy," said a woman near me, not even to anyone, just out loud, the way you'd report weather. "Bit him to the bone." I don't know if those things were true. I want to say that plain, because it matters to the rest of it. In a small place, a dog can earn a reputation the way a man can, half from what he did and half from what people needed to believe about him. And once it's set, you can no more talk him out of it than you can talk the sun down early. By the time that crate rolled into the sun, that dog was already guilty of every dead chicken and missing barn cat in the county. He just hadn't been sentenced yet. The auctioneer tried. God love him, he tried. "Do I have 20 for a working dog? He'll move stock all day, this kind." Nothing. 10 then, $10. A man near the front actually laughed, short and ugly. "Pay you 10 to shoot it," he said, and a few people laughed with him, the relieved kind of laugh, the kind that means thank God somebody said it. And the dog just stood there in his steel box and looked at his point in the middle distance, and didn't give any of us the satisfaction of flinching. I have thought a great deal in the time since about why I lifted my hand. I'd like to tell you it was kindness. It wasn't, not clean. I'd like to tell you I saw something noble in him, some secret worth that the rest of those people were too small to see. That's a lie too, or at least it's the lie you tell afterward to make a dumb thing look like wisdom. The truth is closer to this. I knew what they were going to do to him. I'd seen it before with dogs that didn't sell. There's a man who comes around to the back of these sales for exactly that, and everybody knows it, and everybody finds a reason to be looking somewhere else. And I couldn't be looking somewhere else. Not that day. Not 3 months after I buried my wife, and 4 after I stopped sleeping on her side of the bed because I couldn't stand how it stayed made. Maybe that's it. Maybe a man who's just learned the whole house is empty can't watch one more thing get put down for the crime of being too hard to love. 11, I said. The yard turned. 40 hats turned. I felt the heat come up my neck the way it did when I was a boy and the teacher called my name. The auctioneer looked at me like I'd thrown him a rope off a cliff. $11, he said quick before I could think better of it. 11, do I hear? No, sold. Sold to Walt. He banged the gavel on the rail post, and it was the loudest the yard had been all day. And God help you, Walt. A couple of people laughed. The woman beside me said, low, not unkind, you don't want that animal, Walter. She'd known my wife. Half the county knew my wife. She was the kind people knew. You don't need that on your place, not now. I told her I'd had worse than him in my life, and not all of them had 4 legs, and she gave me the smile you give a fool you've decided to forgive. And that was that. I went and counted out $11 from the 40 I'd brought for a trailer I never bid on, and I did not get my pipe gate, and I drove home with a crate I'd had to wrestle into the bed of the truck alone, because not one of those 40 people would come near enough to help me lift it. I remember that, driving the gravel road home with the windows down and the dust coming up gold behind me. I remember saying out loud to nobody, to her, the way I'd gotten in the habit of talking to her in the truck since the funeral, well, I bought a dog. And I remember almost laughing and then not laughing because the crate behind me was so quiet. A scared dog whines. A mean dog barks. This one did neither. He rode the whole way like a stone rides a riverbed. It wasn't until I backed up to the barn that I understood why the silence had frightened me. I let the tailgate down and looked at him through the bars, and he looked back, finally, turned those pale eyes off the middle distance and put them on me. And there wasn't rage in there. I'd braced for rage. I could have handled rage. What was in there was worse. It was the look of something that had already decided how this ended and was only waiting on me to get to it. He'd been hauled off and sold and hated and handled by strangers his whole life, and somewhere along the way he'd quit hoping any of it would turn out different. He wasn't waiting to be saved. He was waiting to be finished. I have seen that look on people, I won't say where. I didn't open the crate that first night. I'm not ashamed to admit I didn't have the nerve, with the dark coming on and no help and a bad arm that doesn't close the way it should since I broke it a horseback in 09. I set the crate in the empty stall at the end of the barn, the one that used to be the mayor's, and I put down a bucket of water and a bowl of the cheap kibble I keep for the barn cats, and I left the stall door open onto the run so he could come out into the small fenced yard when he was ready, if he was ever ready. Then I worked the crate latch loose with a length of baling wire from arm's length. Like a coward, and I backed out of that barn and I latched the big door, and I stood in my own yard with my heart going like I was 20. I didn't sleep. I'll tell you, I lay there in that made bed I won't unmake, and I listened, for barking, for the crash of him throwing himself at the boards, for anything. The county had handed me a monster for $11 and I'd taken it home, and now I lay awake waiting to hear the proof of what everyone but me already knew. I never heard a thing. And in the morning, when I worked up the courage to crack the barn door at first gray light, the kibble was gone and the water was down and the crate stood open and empty, and he was nowhere I could see. For one cold second I thought he'd found a gap and gone over the fence into the brush, off to be somebody else's dead chicken from now on. Then I saw him. He was as far into the corner of the run as a body could get, pressed into the angle of two fences where the morning shadow still pooled, lying with his scarred chin flat on his paws. Not asleep. Watching me. Holding his point in the middle distance, except the point was me now, and I understood that he had spent the whole night awake the same as I had, the two of us 100 feet apart in the dark, each waiting on the other to do the thing we'd been taught the other would do. I didn't go to him. Something told me not to. I just stood in the doorway with the cold coming off the dewy ground, and I said the only thing I had. "I'm not going to," I said. My voice came out rough. "Whatever they did, I'm not going to, you hear me?" He didn't move. Of course he didn't. You don't undo a life with one sentence at dawn. But I'll tell you what I noticed, what I wrote down in the ledger that morning at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold. The first line of the part of this I still can't explain. When I turned to go back to the house, I looked back once, and his ear, the one he had left, had come up off his skull, just a little, just enough. He was listening. I named him on the third day, which was a mistake, because naming a thing is the same as admitting you've decided to keep it. I called him Ghost, and not for anything dramatic. I called him Ghost because that's what he was on my place those first days, there and not there, a gray shape at the edge of things that vanished the second I turned my full face toward him. I'd be mending the south fence and feel the watched feeling on the back of my neck and look up, and he'd be 60 yards off in the cheatgrass, just standing, just looking, and the moment our eyes met he'd melt off into the brush like he'd never been. He took to following me at a distance when I worked the ranch, never close, never asking, just near, the way a man might keep a hill in sight to know where he is. I want to tell you the truth of these days and not the pretty version, because the pretty version is a lie and you'd know it. He did not become a good dog in a week. There was no warm collapse into my arms, no rolling over for the belly rub, none of the things people who haven't lived it like to imagine. What there was, instead, was 6 days of two damaged things learning the shape of each other across open ground. The first day I couldn't get within 30 feet. He'd let me set the food down and back away, and then he'd eat. But if I came at him direct, he was gone, low and fast and silent, that one ear flat. The second day I tried sitting. I read that somewhere in the long gray months when I read everything, when I'd read the back of a cereal box to keep from thinking, that you don't approach a broken animal standing tall. You sit down and get small and let them come to you. So I sat in the dirt of the run like an old fool with a cup of coffee, and I didn't look at him, and I talked. I talked about the fence, about Royce Hadley, who I'd known and hadn't much liked, about the weather coming, about my wife some, when the talking ran out of safer roads, which it always did. He stayed in his corner the whole time and didn't come an inch, but he didn't leave either. He lay there and let my voice fill up the run, and after a while his chin went down onto his paws, and that was day 2. Here's the thing nobody at that auction knew, the thing I pieced together slow across those days from the scars and the way he moved. Somebody hadn't just neglected that dog. Somebody had fought him, or fought things at him. The scars on his face and his shoulders weren't the kind you get from a fence or a coyote. They were placed, deliberate, the marks of a creature made to be cruel for somebody's sport and then thrown away when he wouldn't do it anymore. Because that was the second thing I figured out, and it broke something in me to figure it. Ghost wasn't mean. A mean dog comes at you. Ghost retreated. Every single time, with every fiber of him, he chose to disappear rather than to bite. Whatever they tried to make him into, he had refused at the cost of every scar on his body, and the county had read that refusal as savagery because the men who done it to him needed a story that wasn't "we tried to break a good animal and he wouldn't break." The brute boy, the bite, I never did learn the truth of it. But I'll tell you, by the 4th day I'd have bet my place that if that dog ever closed his jaws on a person, it was because that person had it coming and then some. The 4th day is when it turned a little. I'd given up sitting close. I'd gone back to just working and letting him orbit me, and I was down at the south fence again, fighting that listing pipe section alone with my bad arm, and I lost it, the pipe, the temper, all of it. The arm gave and the section dropped and caught my shin, and I went down in the dirt cursing in language I won't repeat, sat there in the dust with my leg bleeding and my eyes stinging. And I'll be honest with you, the kind of honest that's hard to write down. I didn't get up right away. I sat there in the cheatgrass with the whole empty country around me and the empty house up the hill behind me and the made bed inside it. And for a minute I just let it have me. The whole weight of the year. You know, the kind of crying that doesn't make any sound. The kind that just leaks out of a man who's run out of the strength to hold it. And I felt him before I heard him. He came up beside me. Ghost. The dog that wouldn't let me within 30 feet for 4 days came and lay down beside me in the dirt of that fence line, not touching, a careful foot away, scarred chin on his paws, and he let out a long breath through his nose and looked off at the same middle distance he'd been looking at since the auction. He didn't lick my face. He didn't do anything a movie dog would do. He just lay down beside the broken thing and kept it company, the way one survivor keeps another. And I understood, sitting there bleeding and crying in the dirt, that he'd come not because I was strong and worth following, but because for the first time he'd seen me down and breaking, and a creature that spent its whole life being the broken one knows that you don't run from another broke thing. You lie down next to it, so it isn't alone. I put my hand out, slow, palm down, not reaching for him, just laying it in the space between us. And after a long while, you understand, I had time to watch a hawk cross the whole sky. He moved his head just an inch and set his chin down on the side of my hand. The weight of it. I can still feel the exact weight of it. 20 pounds of skull and scar and refusal resting on the back of my hand in the dirt, and his pale eye rolled up sideways to watch my face for what I'd do. I didn't do anything. That was the right answer. I just let him. That was day 4, and after that the distance closed fast, the way a held breath lets go all at once. By day 5 he'd take food from my hand, careful as a man diffusing something. By day 5 he slept in the open doorway of the barn instead of jammed in his corner, where he could see me come and go. By day 6 he'd started doing this thing, this small, ridiculous, gut-punching thing, where if I left the yard and came back, his whole back end would go uncertain. This little half-wag he didn't seem to trust himself to commit to, like a dog remembering a language he hadn't been allowed to speak in years. He'd start to wag and then catch himself and look at me to see if it was allowed. It was allowed. God, it was allowed. I told him so every time. I have to tell you about the morally heavy part now, because it happened on day 6, the morning of the day everything else happened. And if I skip it, I'm cheating you. My neighbor came over. Vern Castle runs the place east of mine, decent man, hard man, the kind that's right about most things and warm about none. He came over to return a post-hole digger he'd had since spring, and he saw Ghost lying in the barn doorway, and he went still the way the auction yard had gone still. "Walter," he said, "tell me that's not the Hadley dog." I told him it was. "You bought that thing?" He wasn't asking. "Walt, that dog killed Royce's healer. That dog put the Prout kid in the clinic. You got him here on your place 20 feet from where your grandkids visit." Vern looked at me with something that was halfway to grief. "You're not thinking right. I know this year's been, I know, but you can't keep him. You know you can't. A dog like that, the day it turns on somebody, it's on you. The sheriff will be at your door and there won't be a thing anybody can say." He let that sit. Then quieter, the way you offer a hard kindness. "I'll do it for you if you can't. Tonight. Won't ever say a word about it. Some things a man shouldn't have to do himself." And here's the heavy part. Here's the part I'm not proud of. I thought about it. I did. I'd be lying to you if I said I didn't. Because Vern wasn't wrong, not on the facts, not on the law, not on the cold arithmetic of an old man living alone who can't even hold up a fence section anymore. If that dog ever did turn, and I had no proof in the world he wouldn't, 6 days of evidence against a whole life of scars, it would be on me, and it would be a child because it's always a child, and I would have chosen a wounded animal over a grandchild's face, and there is no ledger in the world you can balance that in. Vern was offering me the easy out, the clean one. Take it from his hands and don't ever have to wonder. I stood there in my yard for a long time, long enough that Vern shifted his weight, and I looked at that dog in the doorway, that dog who'd lain down beside me in the dirt because he knew what broken felt like, that dog just now learning that a wag might be allowed, and I made the decision, and I'll stand on it whatever it cost. No, I said. Walt. No, Vern. My voice didn't shake and I was glad of it. I gave him my word out loud first morning. I knew how it sounded. I know that doesn't mean anything to you. I know it's just a dog, but I've broke enough promises this year to people I loved more than my own life, promises I couldn't keep no matter how I tried, and this is one I can keep and I'm going to. He stays. The cost of him is mine to carry, not yours and not his. Vern looked at me a long while. Then he set the post-hole digger against the fence careful, and he said, "All right, Walter," in a voice that meant he thought I was a fool and had decided to let me be one, and he got in his truck and went home. I want you to hold on to that moment, because Vern Castle drove home from my place on the afternoon of day 6, absolutely certain I had made the worst decision of my widowed life. By the next morning, Vern Castle was sitting in the wet grass of my south pasture with his face in his hands, and he could not look at that dog without his shoulders coming apart. I'll tell you why. The storm came up out of the southwest that night the way the bad ones do, no warning to speak of, just a green weight to the sky at dusk, and then, after dark, the wind. I've lived under that sky my whole life and I know its moods, and I knew by 10 o'clock this was going to be one to remember. The kind that strips fences and floods the washes and rearranges the country a little, just to remind you who's in charge. What I didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that Vern Castle's granddaughter was out in it. She was 4. Her name was Annie. Vern's daughter had brought her up from Phoenix for the week, and somewhere in the chaos of getting stock to shelter before the storm broke, in that frantic dark hour when everybody's yelling and the rain comes sideways, and you're counting heads of cattle and not heads of children, little Annie Castle slipped out the mudroom door after a barn cat, and the wind took the door out of her 4-year-old hands, and the dark and the rain swallowed her whole. I didn't know any of this. I was in my own kitchen with Ghost. He'd come inside for the first time when the thunder started, pressed against the leg of my chair, and I'd let him. I'd put my hand on his scarred head and felt him shaking and said the fence could keep till morning. The phone rang near midnight. It was Vern's wife, and she was barely making words. "Annie's gone. She's out in it. We've been looking an hour. Walt, she's out in it." I'm 61 with a bad arm and a worse hip, and I'll tell you I was out my own door, and in my truck before the receiver hit the cradle. And Ghost came with me. I didn't call him. I didn't have the wit to. He just poured out the door at my heels and was up in the cab before I had the key turned, and I didn't have time to argue with a dog, so I let him stay. You have to understand what we were facing. It was a black, drowning night. The wind was tearing the country up. Vern had a dozen men out by the time I got there, neighbors with flashlights and the headlights of every truck in 3 miles, all of them sweeping the same 100 yards around the house and finding nothing, because a 4-year-old in a storm doesn't stay in 100 yards. The storm moves her, pushes her along ahead of itself like a leaf. And she could be anywhere in 1,000 acres of dark and water, and there is not enough light in the county to find a child that small in that much dark before the cold gets her. And it was getting her. It was June, but that rain was cold, and a wet 4-year-old has maybe a couple of hours, and we were already past one of them. Men were starting to make the sounds men make when they're losing. Vern wasn't making any sound at all, which was worse. And I don't know what made me do it, except that I'd run out of every other thing. I went back to my truck and I opened the door and I got Ghost down out of the cab and I knelt in the mud in front of that scarred, hated $11 dog, and I did the only thing left. I didn't have anything of Annie's for him to scent. I just held his ruined face in my two hands in the rain, and I looked into those pale eyes and I said, "Find her, please. There's a little one out there. Find her." I don't know what he understood. I'll never know. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that dog spoke English, but I'll tell you what he did, and you can make of it what you're able, because I've had a year to make something of it and I still can't. He went still. That same stillness from the auction, that fixing on a point in the middle distance, except this time I understood it wasn't emptiness. It had never been emptiness, it was attention. It was a creature built to read the world, taking the whole roaring dark apart thread by thread. His one ear came up. His nose came up. And then he was gone, off into the black, away from all the lights, away from where the men were looking, out into the open country to the south where not one of us would have thought to go, where the wash runs when it rains. I went after him. I couldn't keep up. An old man can't keep up with a dog in the dark, and I lost him in 30 seconds, and I stood out there past the edge of the lights in the screaming rain, absolutely certain I had just sent the only thing I had left running off into a storm to drown, and that I'd lose him too, on top of everything, on top of everyone. And then away off in the dark, low under the wind, I heard him bark. Ghost, the silent dog, the dog who'd ridden home from the auction quiet as a stone, who hadn't made a sound in 6 days, who whined when he wanted in and never once barked. That dog was barking now, over and over, hard and high and unmistakable, the sound carrying back to us across the open ground, here, 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 here. I have heard church bells. I have heard my wife laugh. I have never in my life heard a sound as good as that dog's voice cutting through that storm. We ran toward it, all of us, every light turning at once and pouring south across the pasture toward that barking, Vern out ahead of all of us now, screaming his granddaughter's name. And we came over the lip of the wash, and there, in the swinging, crossed beams of a dozen flashlights, we found her. She'd fallen down the bank of the wash where the water was already starting to run, and she'd fetched up against a tangle of fence wire and brush, soaked through and gray-lipped and so cold she'd gone past crying into that terrible quiet, too small and too far gone to make a sound that anybody could have heard. Nobody would have found her. I'll say that as plain as I know how. Not in time. Not in that dark, not against that wind, not in the minutes she had left. The water was rising in the wash even as we got to her. Another hour and that wash would have been running 4 feet deep. And Ghost was standing over her. He'd gotten down that bank somehow, and he was standing braced over that child against the rising water, between her and the worst of the wind. And he had her. I need you to hear this. He had a fold of her wet little jacket in his teeth. Those same teeth the whole county swore would tear a person open. And he was holding her, keeping her from sliding the last few feet into the water, holding a child he'd never met out of a flood with the only thing he had, and barking around the cloth in his mouth. And he did not stop. He did not let go, until Vern Castle came down that bank on his knees and gathered up his granddaughter into his arms. Then Ghost let go, and he backed off a step in the mud and the rain, and he sat down, and he looked at me through all those crossing lights with his pale eyes, holding his point in the middle distance the way he always had, like he'd just done a small thing and was waiting to find out if it was allowed. They got Annie to the hospital and she was all right. Cold sick and scared and small, but all right, and home in 2 days, and that's the kind of all right you don't ever stop being grateful for. Vern came to my place the morning after. I was at the south fence still listing. I'd never fixed it, and he walked up through the wet grass and he didn't say anything for a while. Ghost was lying a few feet off in the cheatgrass, watching him, that one ear up. And Vern Castle, the hardest man I know, the man who'd offered to put that dog down with his own hands not 2 days before, walked over and got down in the wet grass in front of him. Slow, old knees. And he reached out one hand, careful, palm down, into the space between them the exact way I had 4 days before, like somebody had taught it to him, and he waited. And Ghost, after a long while, I had time to watch the whole thing. Ghost leaned forward and set his scarred chin down on the back of Vern Castle's hand. Vern made a sound I won't ever forget and I won't ever describe. He put his other hand over his face, and his shoulders came apart right there in my pasture, in front of God and his neighbor, and he stayed down in that grass a long time, and that dog let him. People ask me how. That's the question I get at the coffee counter from the men who used to laugh. How'd that dog know which way to go, with no scent in that storm, out to a wash none of us thought of? How'd a dog that hadn't made a sound in a week know to bark? I don't have an answer that'll satisfy them. I've got theories about wind and water and what a nose like that can pull out of a night I'd call empty. I've got the practical answers and I give them and the men nod. But I'll tell you what I think when nobody's asking. I think that dog spent his whole life being the small, broken thing nobody came for. I think he knew, better than any of us with our flashlights and our trucks, exactly what it is to be alone and cold in the dark and waiting on somebody to come who isn't coming. And I think when I knelt down in the mud and told him there was a little one out there, somewhere under all that refusal and all that scar, something in him understood the assignment in a way that ran deeper than smell. He went looking for the one creature out there more lost and more alone than he had ever been. And he found her, and he didn't let go. Ghost sleeps in the house now, on the bed if you want to know. I unmade her side of it the night Annie came home, finally, and I put a blanket down and he took it and I find I sleep again. He's getting old, same as me. The scars don't fade, but the look in his eyes has mostly the middle distance look, the waiting to be finished look. He doesn't wear it much anymore. Mostly now when I come in from the yard his whole back end goes and he wags without catching himself, without checking if it's allowed, and I think that might be the thing I'm proudest of in all my 61 years. Not anything I built or earned. That. A wag that doesn't ask permission. The county tells the story different now, of course. Now everybody always knew there was something special in that dog. Now nobody ever wanted him put down. That's how it goes. People need the story to come out the way it should have, and so they remember it that way and I let them. But I was there in that auction yard. I heard 40 good people go silent and cold. I paid $11 for the most hated animal in 3 counties because I just learned what an empty house sounds like, and I couldn't watch one more thing get put down for being too hard to love. And 6 days later, he went out into a storm and brought back a child nobody else could find. I write everything down, always have. It's a sickness. But there's a thing I've never once written in that ledger in all the times I've told this, and I've decided I'm not going to write it here either, because some things a man should keep, and you're smart enough to know it without my hand. He's lying here at my feet right now, old gray scarred face on his paws.